No, that's good.
Hi, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me okay?
Sorry.
Yeah, I just want to pop the volume up a little bit more and try that one more time.
Okay.
So I'm just saying-
How's that now?
That's perfect. That's great. Thank you so much.
Past that,
No problem.
feels.
Hi, Erin. Can you hear us
It
okay?
is, Chris, we were.
Yep.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
What's the lowest level? So.
Stuff is not really.
Have to remind her for sure. Yeah, she's in Mexico right now.
Yes.
I can go?
Sure can.
Thank you. Good morning. I'd like to call this meeting of the Community Culture Environment Advisory Committee for Thursday, February 8th to order. First item of business is the adoption of the agenda. Thank you. Sorry, Matthew, I'm sorry, I'm blank. Moved by Matthew, second by Ann. All in favor? Carried. Number 3 on the agenda is adoption of minutes. I assume you've all had a chance to read them, to see them. That's for the minutes of November the 2nd of last year. And any comments, exclusions, anything? Nothing? Motion to receive, to adopt, Steve and John, and that's carried. We have no presentations, but we do have a delegation today. And I'm going to ask Mr. Stewartson perhaps to introduce our guest.
Sure, happy to do that. I'd like to welcome Jonathan to the meeting. He is representing the disc golf community. It is kind of formal as the presentation is here. I know there's a lot of people in the community interested. We've certainly heard that for other avenues. Welcome you to the podium, and then staff will also share some thoughts at the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you, councilors, for having me here. I brought a couple, if you haven't played disc golf, you want to see what they look like, and you're not sure about the sport, that's there. But thank you for having me this morning. Yes, my goal is to discuss about an alternate location for a disc golf course in Abbotsford, and why I think that'd be great for the city as well too. So recently, the city of Abbotsford shared its master plan of a adoption for Mill Lake, and that included 3 plans within it. 2 of those plans, the balance and passive plans, include the option for a disc golf course. So I myself and many others were very excited to see the inclusion of that the city was taking a forward step in looking at bringing disc golf to the city. I tried to get a bunch of all the players from around to voice their opinions on that and to comment on that we wanted to see that here. And I hope many of them shared their opinions as well too. From the 3 plans listed, so the balanced and passive both include the option for a disc golf course. I did a rough mapping based on the map provided there, and I see about 3.5 to 4 acres earmarked for the disc golf course in the southeast corner of Mill Lake. The Professional Disc Golf Association, so these guys run tournaments worldwide. They have standards on course sizes for professional tournaments and all those kind of things. They have course sizes and guidelines on what is a viable course size for beginners to professionals and things like that. Their minimum viable course size is 6 acres for an 18-hole course. Now that is a corridor style course, and corridor would be tightly wooded, narrow fairways, like surrounded by trees, like you're in a forest. 6 acres for 18 holes, so 3 acres for 9. The courses, of course, at Mill Lake would be very open, very few trees and things like that. The minimum viable size that the Professional Disc Golf Association says for that is about 6 acres. So both of these courses would be smaller than the minimum viable size for a beginner course. Now, my goal today isn't to say don't do those at Mill Lake. I think that's a great option for an introductory course for families to bring more people into the sport. Something else to do at Mill Lake, bring people there. It's a great way to increase and grow the sport in the community. My proposal is for the city to allow us to build and design a 9-hole course. I'm going to jump forward on this here a little bit just to have some stuff up on the screen. A 9-hole course at Claiborne Park on Claiborne Road, just right across from the old candy store. I don't know if it has an actual name. I've always called it the old candy store since I've lived here.
General store, yeah.
General store. But that course has a large field, soccer field there, as well as about 14 acres of unused forested portion. There is some open air and stuff as well there as well. I tried to walk through it. It's pretty overgrown right now. There's a single path that goes from the west to the east side behind a house there, and not much else. I found like some garbage and refuse just randomly lying throughout the park and things like that. It's pretty much unused and no one walks there. For reference, Centennial Park in Mission, where a league is hosted, and that is run by the Abbotsford Mission Disc Golf Club, that portion of the park that plays disc golf is about 9 acres. It's a 9-hole course. They have alternate pads that we play to make it 18 holes. About 9 acres there with a semi-open space, whereas we have 14 acres potentially to work with to build a course here. Disc golf in general, if you aren't aware, is a sport that can be played by everyone. So I myself, I run an annual tournament once a year, sorry, I should say. I've run it twice now. I rent Fraser Glen Golf Course just by South Parallel. I rent it for 2 days in October, and I run a singles tournament and a doubles tournament on Saturday and Sunday respectively. Get about 160 players out. I've had everything from 15-year-olds to 50-year-olds playing the tournament. When we look at the age divisions that we see anywhere from 12 to 60, 70 years old that play the sport. The Abbotsford Mission Disc Golf Club runs an annual tournament now. This will be the 3rd year it will be running. The BC Juniors Tournament, and they run that at Raptors Knoll in Aldergrove. That is specifically aimed at juniors, so you're looking at about 12 to 17 years old. And they get about 80 players annually coming out to play, and then they play in the BC Open for those that win. The sport as well is inexpensive compared to many other sports. Not only for playing, for someone getting new into the sport, getting discs and starting the sport out, but also building a course. So a brand new player could spend $50 and have a set of 3 discs. You can even get a bag with that sometimes. And honestly, like, you can have as much fun as you want with those 3 discs. It's not like you bought a cheap set that's going to break in a week or something like that. I know people that still play with their beginner sets years later. A course itself, my estimate for the construction is around $25,000 for a course to be installed and built in Claiborne Park. That includes baskets. Actually, I'll jump ahead here to there we go. Baskets, shipping the baskets, ground kits, that is poles to put them in the ground. And you see I've included an extra 9 there, and that is so that we can have alternate pin locations. Concrete pads, signage, miscellaneous costs, that's just my estimate for like cleaning up some of the things on the holes, just some extra there. And the cleaning would be done predominantly by volunteers. Pretty much every course around here in the Fraser Valley is run by volunteers. Raptors Knoll, which is the largest course in BC, and a top 100 rated course in Canada, is completely volunteer run. Volunteers mow it, volunteers clean it, do the edging. The city does provide watering for the trees because it is still city land. They have a 5-year land lease. But other than that, everything is done volunteer based. There are other benefits as well to building a course here. Claiborne area is continuing to grow. While I was doing research for areas of where we could build a course, there was a beautiful, huge plot of land east of the college up there. But I believe that is owned by a developer, and they're looking to build houses up there from what I understand, as well as just the general area in Claiborne is growing. So this park is gonna see increased use, which may mean, increased, as someone said, the rite of passage to go visit the old brick factory at midnight or something like that. So there's a lot of people that visit the park and a lot of people that visit it at the middle of the night and things like that. So another thing that brings with it is safety. Many courses, sorry, lost my spot there, have observed a drop in crime and vandalism rates in parks after the installation of a disc golf course. Some locations have been selected partially just for this purpose, to increase the usage. People are going through, there's people constantly there. For example, Raptors Knoll, people start playing at 5 o'clock in the morning. Like as soon as the gates are open, they're there playing. And they're there until the gates close at 7, 8 in the summer, right? The sport is incredibly environmentally friendly. So unlike traditional golf, where we have, 30, 40 acres of land of pristine manicured lawns and 5 million gallons of water going into those every single day, we don't need any of that. We don't want to take down trees. We don't want to destroy the natural habitat. We want it to remain as is. Yeah, we have to clean out the underbrush that's there. But we want the trees and all that to remain. We want that to be a wooded course that we can play. That forces us to throw different shots. Unlike traditional, we call it ball golf, where you're just generally hitting straight, or if you're like me, you slice all the time. We can control the angle and the shape of the disc, how far it goes very accurately. You can make it turn left and turn right, and that makes it very different and a very unique sport that we get to play. So playing in a forested course is fantastic, and almost all our courses around us are not forested. So this would be a unique thing that as well brings more disc golfers to the city, because we'd be one of the only forested courses in the Lower Mainland. After installation, there'd be little to no additional maintenance. You don't need to do upkeep on the baskets. You don't need to manicure the lawns, as I said. There's the garbage bin that would probably need to be picked up, which is probably already done because it's a city park already. But beyond that, very little to no maintenance would be required. To sum up what I'm talking about here, the sport is accessible for all ages, has an incredibly low cost of entry, promotes active and healthy lifestyles with little maintenance required. We're asking to utilize land that is currently unused and, as far as I can tell, not very viable for any other sport. We have increased visits to Abbotsford from surrounding areas, bringing revenue to local businesses, as well as schools and education programs can make use of them. For example, my father-in-law is a teacher at Abbey Christian, and the school there has had to go to Mission to play disc golf. There's nothing else nearby. So this would keep schools there, it would bring sports to the community, it would make a park that is relatively underutilized, quite utilized, as well as the area grows and more businesses come, that will mean more people to visit those businesses. I'd like to thank Matthew for all his help in helping prepare this as well and his guidance. And I'd like to just add a few other remarks onto this. You can see there's a news story there, and unfortunately I didn't have time to add this in, but there was a recent news story just in the Mission newspaper. A gentleman I've played with many times on how disc golf helped him overcome addiction. It was something that he could do and get out with people and enjoy being outside and not have, take him away from the need to utilize other substances. It was a great story, so I wish I had a copy of it to provide, but it is in the Mission paper. Thank you.
That's it?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now, floor is open for questions. Go
I have,
ahead, John.
I'll just start with a question. I've got some comments too. But,
Sure.
what about the costs of? I'm thinking if the usage ramps up, and it certainly will, because it's becoming, it's a growing sport and a lot of attention. But
Yes.
what about washroom facilities, things like that? Right now, there's some porta potties on site there, but.
Honestly, I think a single porta potty, and I hadn't looked into the cost of that, but Raptors Knoll has a single porta potty on site, and that is managed fine for the course size, and that's an 18-hole course that brings in, I think it was, I'm gonna guess a little bit here, but it was about 25,000 rounds last year played there.
Yeah.
And that is.
And they only have, that's it? That's
Yeah.
all they got there? Oh, wow, okay.
John, we know that we've been in discussion with PRC About washrooms going in right adjacent to Turner House.
That's right,
Because
yeah.
Turner House will be,
So that's
Turner House
already,
will be programming space, right?
oh, great,
So-
that's already in the works then.
Yeah, as far as I know, but the plan is not in, it's not a firm plan yet
No, I
for the
understand,
park.
yeah.
It doesn't start until this summer, right? So, but I think that'll come.
Sure, I was even thinking like parks, something more permanent like what we have on the dike, you know,
Yeah,
down at
this
the
is,
Mission
I think
Bridge.
that's what they're looking
Something
at.
like that.
Because there's no access, our place is on a lot, a
Yeah.
stamp size lot, but there's access to water.
Okay,
And so it'll probably be over somewhere where we
And
are
that would have
because
to
the
be-
services are already existing there.
and that would be maintained by parks then, I guess, or just well, that would, okay, so then there's no real cost for you.
Perfect.
Okay.
One thing done, all right.
Further?
Just, yeah, sorry, just a couple of
Go
quick
ahead.
comments. So, yeah, I play, and it's a lot of fun, and I have to go to Mission. In fact, we don't have a permanent course here in Abbotsford. Chilliwack's got, what, 2 or 3?
They have two, well, and they've just built a third one on the, what was that? The retreat up there, the huge place by Cultus.
Yeah,
So he's built another third small one there.
Okay.
And I believe the city is looking at the potential of another one, as well as another gentleman has just built one on Indigenous land there as well.
Okay,
too. So
okay.
there's technically 4.
I'm not a good player by any means, but
It's fun.
what I learned about it, what really, we started, like the Gulf Islands, they've all got courses, of course they do. But the learning curve is really easy with this, whereas with, traditional golf,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's almost impossible to become a good golfer anymore. The costs involved in that, and the frustration of learning how to play. Whereas disc golf, you enjoy it right from the very first day you play, and it's wonderful that way. It's very user friendly.
Yeah, exactly. I'm a member of the British Columbia Disc Golf Association. I'm the registrar director on that board. And one of our mandates and goals is to increase for new players and things like that. Like, we have a lot of players that play tournaments, and we're going to see the same, 1,000 people at all the tournaments across BC. So how do we get the other 8,000 to 10,000 that aren't, the weekend warriors that are just there playing once or twice and things like that, and increase the sport for them and bring new players in?
Yeah, and finally, for me, I mean, the environmental consideration is really leans, towards sustainable use of land, where people can still go and participate and enjoy the space without degrading the biodiversity and the sustainability of the area. So, yeah, it's a win for me for sure. I support it.
Disc golf is often called walking with purpose.
Christina, did you have a question?
Not really questions, but just comments, like, for you specifically, so something to keep in mind. So I live just down the street from the one in Mission.
Okay.
We operate one site at Mill Lake, and we don't operate, we lease one site, Turner House, which is that house that you walk behind.
Okay.
So either which way you turn, you're gonna end up with me for a neighbor, just for reference. And I do like to play myself, so I'm gonna preface my comments with that. So Mill Lake, I think, is a really good spot for something like that. I would be a little bit sort of like the, how am I gonna put this, cart before horse, because you need things like parking spaces too, right?
Yes.
So we're really early in the game for those kinds of things. We don't know where those things are going yet, but for Claiborne. But one thing that you do have to be really cognizant of is that you are immediately right next door to Sahakam 3. Sahakam 3 is Sahakam 3 because there is Indigenous historic use and prehistoric use. Archaeology in the province of British Columbia is classified. It's not easy to pull permits. And I'm not supposed to tell you where the sites are. I can tell you, though, that you are going to have to consider what's under the ground, because right where that property is prehistoric Indigenous settlement.
Okay.
And it's not just like stray finds, it's settlement. So keep that in mind.
Are you talking about the Claiborne Park?
Yes.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that.
I think
Because it's
I think we're
classified.
this little presumptuous here that
Yes.
this is going to go through staff and
Yeah,
obviously.
absolutely, and
yeah.
all I'm saying is that you have to keep that in mind, because, again, you don't need to go in the ground for these things, it's about, everything is
Couple
above
feet
ground.
deep, yeah.
But what you do have to consider is this BC's first company town, and all of the above ground remains that you're seeing. I mean, I could support something like this as long as we're very aware that we're going around those above grounds, because I think, this is a great opportunity for people to get, like, you can actually interpret those things, and for people to actually get eyes on them. People do use the park, but those are sort of organic trails that are in there. They're not ones that city puts in, right? They're not ones that were planned. They just exist because people tear around in the sticks. And right now, what we're seeing a lot is things like the fencing and stuff that's around the historic parts has been wrecked. It's down, it's bent out of shape, spray painted for many, many months. And, we will report that in because we're to the city, because we're the neighbor, the immediate neighbor, and also the organization that likes to keep track of all the heritage assets. However, then the city will go, well, that's not our fencing. And the Historical Society will go, well, that's not our fencing, and so the fencing is still down. So these are good opportunities that you can, if you're wanting to push for something like this, is again, the safety aspects,
Yeah.
It would be a great partnership, like if we could partner up and say, okay, let's do this together. We provide the interpretation, you bring the people in.
Yeah, and one of my goals, like, so I believe there's gonna need to be some fundraising to help get, facilities and things like that for the course and for us to build it. Along with that, like, if we can partner with someone like, hey, X amount of your fee goes to this and X amount of your fee goes to supporting restoration of the fence and things like that to help us keep the park safe and clean.
I'm just wondering if, Todd, if this is a good time for you to chime in and talk a bit about strategy and long-term planning with regards to your department.
Absolutely. Yeah, and happy to share some thoughts. The first one being that Mr. Snyder put together a very quality presentation, very professional. I want to commend you on that. Very accurate. I would say things like the cost estimates, certainly rung true with me. It was within the order of magnitude, absolutely. I would think the one thing that he undersold was the accessibility of the sport. Like the cost of entry there from an equipment standpoint, even the accessibility from a physical standpoint. I am aware of people with sensory considerations that can easily activate themselves in the sport. So, and I do want to emphasize that sport piece. There are a lot of communities that still think this is an activity. It is truly a sport, and we as staff recognize that. Also want to thank you for the acknowledgement around the Mill Lake Park piece. We have included that as an introductory activity. So staff are already supportive of the concept of introducing this into Abbotsford. I think one of the challenges and where there's a solution is Claiborne Park comes with a few complications. We've noted some already, but one of the ones we're actively working on is the fact that the entire park is not owned by the city. Part of it is owned by the community association up there, what we would consider the field, and most notably the parking area. So we're actively engaged with them to, I'll call it, modernize our agreement. That's kind of a first step that we need to undertake before we get to 2027, which is when we undertake a Claiborne Park master plan. So I think it would be a little presumptuous to look at kind of implementing this in advance of that master plan. However, I think there's an avenue to take this sport forward, and that is in 2024 with a sport court and a sport field strategy that we're working on. Staff are actually developing some of the terms of reference right now. We're planning on rolling it out fairly early this year. This is a sport. I want to emphasize that to again everybody here and beyond. We would be happy to work with Mr. Snyder and the entire sport community to bring that forward through that strategy. And one of the things we've said very clearly to a lot of other sports is don't get fixated on the location, right? This sport has merits. We're happy to work with any sport group in terms of where are some of the locations that are viable in the short, medium, and long term. So again, I applaud you for the presentation here, the information. It's spot on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Todd.
I'll just
Go ahead.
add one thing. Fraser Health doesn't really promote just one sport or anything, but in terms of like active living, the best impact on people's health for active living is either active transport, you're able to bike to work or something like that, and then the second is actually doing something you like doing. That's active. So leisure time physical activity is one of the best things that you can do for in terms of impacts on weight and health and all that kind of stuff. So just having accessible options and especially options that are accessible by transit. So there's that one Raptors Knoll, but you can't get there by public transit. It's I think 20 minutes drive or something, and same with Mission. But yeah, you said that there was 25,000 rounds played at Raptors Knoll, so it's about 70 a day.
And that's just, I should add, just the ones listed in the UDisc, which is what we use for keeping score. So I'm sure there's a multitude of people that don't keep score and just play.
That's right, yeah, we just go and play.
Yeah, just those are the measured ones. There's all the unmeasured ones as well too.
And so in terms of like preventable healthcare in Abbotsford, it is in the magnitude of the municipal's budget on policing and engineering put together. Like it's actually that much healthcare dollars goes into preventable illness, caring for preventable illnesses. So having things accessible that people like doing is a real powerful thing. Doesn't really matter where they are, but if they're accessible and
Good comment, thanks. Yeah, John?
Just one more, excuse me, observation. I mean, when I was coaching soccer, we tried using the playing field there occasionally, and it was usually a failure because that field is, I don't know, has never been really truly maintained as a playing field. It's usually too wet to do anything with, and I can imagine if you wanted to upgrade that in parks to a full-on playing field, I can't even imagine what the cost would be, but it would be significantly more than this. And the other, and so I see that as an appropriate use of that park in terms of getting more usage and perhaps expanding the parking area a little bit into that space. I don't think it would change things very much. Mill Lake, on the other hand, I think is almost too developed. I can't, when I saw the idea of disc at Mill Lake, I thought, there's a lot of traffic there, and there's people, and it's confined by roads all the way around that are very, heavily used. I just think that I never thought of Claiborne as a location, but I think it's wonderful. Yeah.
And maybe just to pick up on John's point around the cost piece for kind of a sense of order of magnitude, the renovation of a soccer field. So new turf, irrigation, drainage is probably in the order of about $500,000.
Yeah.
And again, that's very site dependent on what you're doing. So it can kind of deviate by 20, 30, 40% depending on some characteristics there. But for $25,000, we're looking at a disc golf course
The
here.
water table is incredibly high in Claiborne.
Yeah.
And you have to be really careful too, because that's a salmon bearing stream that butts up right up against it, right? So you can't just do whatever, and fisheries and oceans are gonna get in your face about it, so, and this would be probably a better option.
Okay, any last comments or questions for our guest? If not, thank you very much
Thank you very much for your time.
for your presentation, and I'm sure our department, our staff will be in touch with you over the coming months and years.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
I would say in weeks here.
Well, I don't set their schedule.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Wait around here till we leave.
Either we're at the public meeting, so you can wait if you want, so.
Thank you.
All right then, that brings us to our first and only report, but a very important one. Melissa Price is here to present on the tree protection bylaw stage 2 update. So Alyssa, welcome here.
Thank you.
I hear you have some exciting things to share.
So maybe just as way of a quick introduction, if you don't remember from last meeting, Melissa is our Parks Planning Manager. Melissa's been leading an array of staff to develop the tree protection, hopefully tree management bylaw. We're looking at reframing it over the last number of months. She's been working with colleagues in operations, that includes parks, in planning and development, and engineering, also some of the experts in the field. You saw her last meeting and she provided a high-level introduction. She's back with a few more refined thoughts. So, Ms. Price.
Hi. So, yeah. So this presentation, because of the nature of the project, it's a regulatory bylaw. It's got a lot of detail to it. So I think I'm gonna go through the first kind of background section relatively quickly. We can always touch on any kind of that background context more so if you've got questions about it, but just for the sake of not taking too long to go through it. Okay. So we are currently in stage 2 of this process. We, again, as Todd mentioned, we came to you with sort of an overview of where we were heading. We've gone through a process of refining those updates and recommendations more so. And of course, we're taking the direction from our urban forest strategy, which we got approved through council in 2022, as well as our PRC master plan, which also gives us direction to update this bylaw. So I probably will just touch on this briefly, just as a reminder. We have some broad categories of tools that we use to manage forests in our community, kind of higher level policy tools, one of those being our new urban forest strategy, and then our zoning and sort of regulating land use tools, so our zoning bylaws and development bylaw. And then what we're talking about today are the actual tools that regulate trees themselves. So that would be development permits and our bylaw itself. So I put this slide on here just to kind of highlight the fact that there are these sort of 3 different categories of tools we use, and to emphasize that these tools have to kind of work together if we're going to have good outcomes with managing our urban forestry into the future. So I'm going to get right into the presentation. We've organized the presentation, or sort of the recommendations to council, based on sort of major changes to the bylaw, as well as sort of more just those administrative and best practice changes. So the major ones are going to really change how through the bylaw we regulate retention, removal, protection, and replacement of trees. And then those admin best practice are really just small changes to the bylaw, either through definitions and things like that are going to bring clarity, consistency, and help us respond to sort of industry and our arboricultural best practices, making sure our bylaw is up to date with respect to how things are happening in the industry. So getting right into it, of the major influence updates, recommendations 1 and 5, 1 to 5 are really related to which trees we're going to regulate with this bylaw and how we can better protect those trees. So recommendation 1 is talking about expanding the tree retention area. So in our bylaw, we define a tree retention area, which are some of the trees that the bylaw hopes to protect and regulate, are trees sort of within those riparian areas, trees that would be identified through a development plan process, identified on a plan, protected by a Section 219 covenant. And so we're really looking to add those steep slope areas, which are identified in our official community plan, into those areas, because those areas can often be quite sensitive. So it's bringing it also just into alignment with policy from our official community plan. So with each recommendation, I've just highlighted a couple of anticipated outcomes or sort of rationale as to why this recommendation is being put forward. Recommendation 2 is to expand the definition of what we actually consider a tree to be regulated under the bylaw. So this is going to include trees that are greater than or equal to 10 centimeters in diameter in those tree retention areas. So not across the city, but those retention areas. And then all replacement trees. So currently, when people are required to replace trees, they'll go into the ground and they're quite small. So currently, we go through a process of regulating and replacing trees to hopefully grow our canopy, but those trees we're replacing are not protected currently. So this is looking at, let's actually protect those assets that we are wanting to have planted and protected until they can reach sort of, full size. city trees of any size, yard trees required through subdivision. And then a particularly new area of the bylaw that we're wanting to explore because we've gotten feedback that it's just not clear, when do we regulate these, when do we not? So this conversation sort of around, I guess I would say, in air quotes, hedges, because depending on who you ask what a hedge is, you'll get a different definition. So we're trying to identify circumstances where we're calling it a row of at least 5 trees that are planted closely together in a hedge-like form, but where at least one of those is greater than or equal to 20 centimeters. So in that case, we're saying this is something we're going to protect and regulate through the bylaw, in which case it would require replacement.
Do you want to define DBH for the committee?
Yes, so I've already used it a little bit interchangeably, so in diameter. So DBH is diameter at breast height, so it's a method of measuring how big that tree is. So it's just a standard approach to measuring, so diameter at breast height is what that stands for. And then again, this would just provide clarity on the size of tree that's regulated in the bylaw, emphasize protection of community assets, so those city trees, regardless of their size, and then it's going to close the loophole on when newly planted trees are protected. Recommendation 3 is to compile a list of city-owned significant trees that meet one or more of the criteria listed in our bylaw. So significant trees is a provision that's currently in our bylaw, but it has not been acted upon to date. So we did receive feedback that through this process that is something that we should be doing in our community, and we want to start doing that. And so our recommendation has kind of been, let's really look at this more so on the public lands to start identifying these city significant trees, to sort of set a bit of a framework and a sort of a community knowledge of what these trees are and what they would look like and what might be considered a significant tree. But we could also use the same criteria that's in our bylaw already to start identifying and protecting these significant trees on private lands through sort of the subdivision and review process. We could look at protecting them through sort of existing means that we already do through those processes, but if it were mutually agreeable with the developer and the city, we could look at also nominating those to a schedule. So it's something we could start exploring also on private lands, but I think the initiative from probably a staff resourcing perspective would be to focus on the public lands first. And again, a significant tree that would be nominated to a schedule approved by council would provide the highest level of tree protection in the community. It would build awareness around what significant trees are, and we could secure those on private lands through mutual agreement. Recommendation 4 would be to start requiring a security deposit. So we currently do require security deposits to retain trees on development sites through a development permit process, but we currently don't have that mechanism for tree cutting permits. So there's sort of 2 streams in which we're approving tree removal and protection. So we're just looking at standardizing the approach to that security deposit based on the size of the tree. So we're sort of valuing the tree that's being protected versus the fencing and the things that are typically being secured. So it's just a little bit of a reframing, but it's also looking at what is, sort of putting more onus on the value of those trees that we're hoping to protect on site. And of course, the deposit would be refunded upon, completion of the construction and successful retention of the tree. And to basically standardize this approach between the 2 streams of permitting to incentivize hopefully greater protection and improve accountability and reduce tree damage during construction stages, to enable more robust enforcement because we have clear guidelines around how that could be enforced, and then to hopefully improve protection of our urban forest ultimately through those construction phases. Recommendation 5 is clear enforcement and mitigation mechanisms in cases where those tree protection requirements are not upheld during construction. So these last 2 are kind of around the idea of construction, and we currently don't have very good outcomes. We put a lot of emphasis into identifying trees that we want to protect, so much so that we'll even have very good buy-in from the development community, but things sort of tend to unravel a little bit when the machines start moving on the ground. And so these last 2 are really looking at how can we hopefully better improve that protection process during the construction period. So this would be looking at, when we collect these securities, if there's some level of damage to a tree, but through a professional assessment, it's determined that there can be some mitigation measures done to, keep that tree in some healthy form, we would just be putting forward a recommendation that a portion of their security deposit would be retained, if that were. And then, of course, if they the tree is completely destroyed and unable to be mitigated or retained in any way, then they would be forfeiting security deposits. And that money be put forward to planting elsewhere, either on city lands, in parks and whatnot. So the anticipated outcome is hopefully we can, it's one way to incentivize greater protection, improve accountability, and reducing tree damage during construction stages. And then also providing a clear process for seeking mitigation work and compensation for damages, should that occur. All right, so the next set of recommendations, 6 to 16, and there are 16 of the major recommendations, are to do with retention and replacement of trees. And I've grouped the first two because they all deal with, the first three because they all deal with strengthening the city's ability to refuse removal permits. And this was feedback we did get through this last few stages of engagement with external stakeholders as well as internal staff, that we need to firm up the city's ability through the bylaw to refuse certain scenarios where we can issue permits. So recommendation 6 is to allow a refusal to remove a tree that is greater than or equal to 60 centimeters diameter at breast height, unless it's necessary for the health of the tree or nearby trees or for safety or sort of immediate damage to infrastructure. So that's currently just adding another layer. This is looking at sort of these trees that are getting to be significantly bigger. And if there's no immediate reason for health, safety, infrastructure, then we should be looking at retaining those trees as much as we can. Removing the nuisance and obstruction from the existing bylaw. So this is just a very, very subjective condition. And so we're just looking at removing that. It doesn't mean that if something is through an assessment, it's ultimately deemed to be a real nuisance. We can still do that, but it's just taking it out as sort of a blanket reason. And then replacing the clause with that allows removals to prevent significant immediate damages to infrastructure and structures. So it's kind of putting more tangible, measurable things in there instead of being just so subjective. Recommendation 8 is require permit applicants to submit reports from certified arborists or registered professional foresters when requesting removal of those significant trees or trees that are greater than 60 centimeters DBH or trees in retention areas. So these are the key trees we're trying to protect. We're trying to put our focus on protecting these types of trees. And so if you're wanting to remove them for no particular reason, then we really want to add some more rigor around that review process by requiring these reports. With hopes to expand the city's ability to refuse tree removal permits where it doesn't make sense, respond to feedback from our technical advisory review stage, remove some of the subjectivity from it, and improve protection of our forests. Is everybody still doing okay? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so recommendation 9. This would be requiring private persons that are requesting the removal of a city tree to pay the city the following amount for the removal if we agree to, in fact, allow it to be removed. So the cost of purchasing, planting, and maintaining the replacement tree for 1 year, as well as the amenity value of that tree, calculated at an industry standard appraised method. So this is attempting to recognize that trees on city property are a community asset, and they provide a lot of benefit to the community. So this is trying to, where a private person is in many cases benefiting from the removal of a city asset, a community asset, then we're trying to value that at a more reasonable rate, or a more, not reasonable, but maybe more accurate, an accurate reflection of what that amenity value is to the community. And so the bylaw will differentiate between community assets and private trees in that regard. ensure adequate compensation for the costs of the tree replacement and for the loss of the tree's amenity value to the community, and then help to incentivize tree retention. So we did a couple of assessments through our urban forestry team recently, some recognizable trees around the civic facility here. So this is a oak tree right in front of City Hall, just on South Fraser Way, the corner there, corner of, I guess that's Justice. Is that correct? Yeah. So this tree was, through that industry standard appraisal method, was valued at $38,000. And then we did this large fir, which is just right out here in front of the old courthouse, one of the large single stem firs there. And that one came in at just under $95,000. So just to give you an idea, those are two large trees. So these valuations can be anywhere from $1,000 to over $100,000, just depending on the tree, the size, the species, the location, the uniqueness. So there's some measurements that go into that appraisal process. Right, now recommendation 10 is to update tree replacement ratios. So our current bylaw sets out some replacement ratios which are standard, and we don't really intend to change those. However, we do want to recognize the fact that our bylaw is now putting more emphasis on some of these larger trees, greater or equal to 60 centimeters DBH, and so we want to recognize that with a slightly higher replacement ratio of 4:1. But then also for those smaller trees that we're recognizing, whether they're in retention areas or just smaller trees that are recently planted that for some reason are being removed and must be replaced, so just a 1:1. So kind of recognizing that they're still at that smaller stage in their life. And then allow, again, this is talking about sort of like hedge in brackets, rows of protected trees to be replaced. This is something new that we think is appropriate in a very limited context. So where we do have those closely planted rows of trees, and we've identified them as something to be regulated under the bylaw, we're saying that they can be replaced with another hedge. So you could, in this case, plant like cedar hedging or something like that, or it can be replaced for every 4 meters of it with one normal tree. This is just recognizing that in some contexts, especially as we densify more and have very small lots and have even really built out industrial areas, sometimes a hedge is really the only, in some cases, viable approach to putting some sort of tree canopy back into the site. So it's not something we want to practice across the board, but where we have a situation where we kind of already have that situation, sometimes it makes sense to put something similar back in. And then for counting replacement trees, this is another, I guess, terminology that I'll just touch on a little bit when we talk about a species that is small at maturity or medium at maturity or large at maturity. It's talking about the span of the crown of the tree at maturity, because we'll start getting into more of the recommendations where we see a bit of a shift in our bylaw and that our focus is really on achieving canopy coverage across the community as opposed to just, you have to have 10 trees just because. It's more focused on what is the outcome of the canopy cover to align sort of with the strategies of our urban forest strategies. So we'll start talking about, the size of trees at maturity. It's important because if you have a small tree at maturity, it's not going to give you the same canopy coverage long-term as a large tree or a medium tree would. So for that, with the replacements, we're also introducing this kind of new idea that if you're wanting to place small trees at maturity on your property because maybe you have some planting constraints, you can still do that, but it's going to count as 0.5, just the same as a large tree at maturity would count as 2. So it gives a little bit more flexibility with how we can achieve the planting requirements on site to reach that ultimate canopy cover. So again, just reflecting that we want to have greater replacement for notably larger trees and less for notably smaller trees, greater flexibility in selecting our appropriate stock to meet site-specific conditions, and then allowing some limited application of hedges. Recommendation 11, so to reduce the size of replacement trees at the time of planting. So we did receive feedback through this process that our current standard of having a replacement tree, a deciduous and or coniferous tree A 6 centimeter caliper is typically what our requirement is now, as well as a 3 meter height conifer. So we've shrunk those down to 5 and 2 respectively for our standard replacement tree. And then we're also saying when we are replacing with hedges, that we want those hedges to be at least 1.5 meters in height for any kind of hedging species. And that's just really to eliminate, putting things like shrubs in, boxwoods and things that aren't going to give us a canopy long-term. Excuse me. And then within those retention areas, these are really talking more about those environmentally sensitive areas, whether they're riparian areas or steep slope areas. We're saying, let's reflect some of our current practice that we're already doing to some extent through a development permit process, and recognizing that it often makes more sense to introduce even smaller stock sizes into those areas. So 5-gallon pots with an even smaller stem diameter to just provide more flexibility with getting into some of these naturally sensitive areas. You can bring them in with hands and people as opposed to machines, and you're generally being less disruptive as you plant that size stock in some of those sensitive areas than you would be to bring in machines to bring in huge root balls and plant those. So so again, still try to be a little bit more nimble, add a little bit more flexibility in how we allow replacements to happen, focusing on the end result of canopy cover long term. Okay, now recommendation 12 is where we start getting into this really sort of shift in how we want to think about our bylaw to align with our strategy, which is talking about density targets for canopy. So our urban forest strategy tells us that we want to have a 40% canopy cover citywide by 2045. So a lot of the recommendations in this bylaw are trying to shift us towards that sort of approach. So the first one is to use a tree density target of 60 trees per hectare of net developable area to place a cap on the replacement planting. So normally when you look at what's required to be replaced on the site, you look at all the trees that are being cut, you see how big they are, you do your replacement ratios, and you say, okay, you need 50 trees or 100 trees or 10 trees. So this is really taking that out of it to an extent. It's saying, like, regardless of how many trees you start with, we want you to achieve this density target. So it's kind of, if you had a heavily treed site, it would be putting a cap on it. Because ultimately what we're trying to achieve is 40% canopy cover. This is just a few, didn't remember putting this slide in here, but it's a good visual. So it's 3 scenarios, and I guess it's trying to illustrate how that would cap. So in the first scenario, it's saying let's cut 1 tree. And so typically your replacement ratio would be 2, because you would have 0, then you would plant 2 trees. But in property B, I think I missed the first part up there. So in this scenario, the 60 trees per hectare would be 3 trees. That number would equal to 3 trees. So in the first one, you would replace it at your replacement ratio. And B, because you're removing 1, but you still have 3 on your property, you wouldn't actually have to replace any trees, because you're still reaching your canopy cover target. And similarly with option C, you're removing 1 tree, but you have a large tree that counts as 2 replacements. So again, you wouldn't have to provide replacement trees. So it's looking at more of a canopy target outcome. Yeah, so it's introducing this idea of capping on heavily treed sites. And the idea is that will enable gradual balance of tree canopy over time. These are just some scenarios of lots in the city where you could envision certain types of development. So for the first one here, it's an infill lot of about 400 meters squared. So to meet that canopy target, it's a 2-tree requirement. So you might already have 2 trees on your property, and therefore you wouldn't be replacing any more if you were to cut, This is looking at, a size of a site that could potentially have a 4-plex on it, a duplex or a 4-plex. It's about in that size range. So the required number of trees on this site would be 4 trees to achieve that 40% canopy coverage. Again, this is a site that, it's got a single building on it now, but it's about the size where you would start seeing, potentially a small apartment building. And this would be 9 trees on this size of the site. And again, a small to sort of medium townhouse site, 27 trees. It's just to give you an idea of how those numbers would sort of play out in different development scenarios. Recommendation 13 is to look to incentivize tree retention on these developing properties. So we would count whether a property reaches the tree density target with its net developable area, and basically credit for any trees being retained. So if you're retaining a large tree, you would be able to gain a credit for that based on the typical replacement requirements for that tree. So it's looking at ways to in some way incentivize retention on site. And then similarly for planting credits would just align with those replacement ratios. And obviously none for trees that are not in good health or hazardous. And the anticipated outcome is just really greater retention on developing properties, incentivizing meaningful tree planting on developing properties, so the right fit over quantity. And recommendation 14 is to increase the cash in lieu amount. So currently, the cash in lieu amount for a tree that you're forfeiting, you're saying you're not gonna replace, a replacement tree amount is $300. So we're looking at increasing these cash in lieu amount to $500 and $750. And this is essentially just to kind of balance out what the market rates are for buying, planting, and maintaining a tree for a year. And then we would also require the same the same cash in lieu amount as a security. So if you are replacing trees, we would also take that as a security, and then obviously once you planted the tree, then that security would be released. Again, pricing more accurately reflects the cost recovery for purchase, installation, and maintenance, and it may encourage actually more planting and less forfeiting of the cash in lieu, especially as we introduce more variations in how you can replace those trees. Recommendation 15 is now talking about a density target of trees per hectare net developable area to require developing properties to achieve a minimum. So recommendation 12 was talking about capping, these sites that have maybe a lot of trees and capping them at their replacement requirement. And this is now looking at establishing minimum density of trees through those development processes. So where you might have a site that has only no trees or a couple of trees, they may actually be required to plant more trees in order to reach that minimum density target. So it's kind of trying to balance the approach, not just penalize people who have trees, but also just bring sort of more balance long-term to achieve that 40% canopy cover across the city. So yes, sparsely treated sites will be planted to meet canopy targets, citywide equitable approach, and gradual balancing of the canopy. And our final major influence update is really just looking at these limited areas of rural residential properties that are not in the agricultural land reserve. And this is basically looking at allowing them to have some flexibility and freedom to remove up to 5 trees a year without removal or permit fees and without replacements. And this would be subject to them maintaining their density, their canopy target of 60 trees per hectare, and also excluding those significantly larger trees or trees within the retention area. So provided that they're, managing trees that aren't sort of in those sensitive areas or aren't significantly large trees, then it gives them some flexibility to manage their forests on their property, recognizing that often some of these properties do rely on their resources for daily needs, such as firewood and things like that. So that is the end of the major recommendations. Sean, do you want me to just keep going through the admin?
Is this section, I can't remember, is this a long section or is this?
It's pretty brief.
Yeah, just finish it off, yes.
Okay, so these again are these more nuanced, smaller changes. We do intend to, or we are recommending that we rename our bylaw from tree protection bylaw to tree management bylaw. And this is really just to more effectively describe the purpose and the scope and the extent of what this bylaw is meant to do. to improve and standardize permit information requirements. So when we get arborist reports and hazard tree assessments and win-through assessments, just that they're coming to us in the same standardized approach with the same information and the same layout with the same analysis included. It just helps streamline that review process. And then clear and update definitions. So some of these would just be to clarify definitions around damaging activities, topping and lift pruning, and setting out specific clarity around what is damage to a tree so that it can be properly enforced. To clarify how we measure trees that have multiple stems, because there's a little bit of incongruency currently. Hazardous tree assessment approach, and then some new definitions that just support some of the other recommendations, like to define what a developing property is and to define what net developable area is in order to support some of those bigger recommendations. And then to more effectively protect tree roots. So we currently just use a very standard definition of drip zone, and it's in some cases it doesn't accurately identify the actual root protection zone of a tree. So this would be looking at updating how we define the critical or the protection zone around a tree. It will make it more flexible in how we determine that, but also more accurate. And then another thing, this is just an example of introducing new standards for protection barriers. So we currently have one standard, and we did receive feedback that oftentimes it's quite expensive to build this type of barrier, not this shown here, but where we have a largely, basically it's a wood-built fence, and then we cover it with a similar fencing you see here, the orange fencing, but we gotten a lot of comment that sometimes that's quite expensive, and then often the materials just go to waste. They go into the dumpster bin after, so it's also a lot of wasting of materials, and so we're looking to introduce a couple of other standards, this being one that we've used a couple of times more recently, which is basically looking at using these wood stakes and aircraft cables to kind of hold them in place, and then putting that high-vis fencing over top of it. So it's using resources that are less costly to purchase, result in the same outcome, but also can be largely recycled and reused, probably more easily. So taking in some of those recommendations from the industry that we heard. And E is basically, we talked about this in the high level presentation, but just making sure that our species list for tree replacement is reflecting climate adaptation. It's going to align with changes to our stock sizes for replacement, and then improve species diversity, hopefully. Fees and penalties, just looking at some basic fees to help us recover some of our administrative costs and deter infraction. So we currently don't charge an application fee for a tree cutting permit, so it's just looking at a nominal, non-refundable application fee just to cover some of the administrative costs for reviewing and administering that permit. And then also if, when we have to do subsequent site inspections that we would incur, we would be able to recuperate some of the staff costs to do sort of, if we have to do multiple site visits to address issues on site. So we are just in sort of toward the latter end of stage 2. We were at council Tuesday, and they gave us direction to proceed to the next stage, which is to committees, and then to start reaching out to our community to show them the recommendations. So we do plan to, we just launched our Let's Talk page today, just before we came here. We are going to be hosting some in-person pop-up events, 4 of them over the next couple of weeks. And we'll be proceeding to DTAC committee February 15th. So hopefully through this process, we will refine our refined recommendations even further, and then be able to bring back and report back what we heard hopefully next month back to council. So any of the feedback we hear from you today will help inform our decisions. We are hoping that the committee will endorse the recommendations for the major influence changes that were shown on the slide today, but were also, I think, sent to you in this background report, which has a lot more detail than what I've been able to do in the presentation today.
Great, thank you very much, Melissa. Very thorough, very interesting. Yeah, I'm encouraged by the direction you're taking it, staff. So now it's our committee's opportunity to have some input, clarifications, anyone?
There's a lot there, so we appreciate it. It's, borderline overwhelming sometimes.
Robin?
Councillor Lowen, it'd be nice if we could get someone to move and second the motion before we discuss.
Well, that would be nice, I agree. Who would move the recommendation? Aaron, moved by Aaron, seconded by, thank you, Christina. All right, we're open now for conversation, discussion.
You probably have tons. So
Yeah,
Matthew, go for it.
So your example there of that single family dwelling that was 560 square meters, and there's one tree out front they wanted to remove. Basically, with the new legislation, you're actually, say if that was close to one of those designated bus stops, you're allowed a sixplex there. So like basically the sledgehammer legislative response of the new housing is almost, I think in Abbotsford it's up to like 90% of single family dwellings will be able to apply for a fourplex, 4-unit dwelling. So is this sort of almost going to be like a moot point by the time it gets passed with that new legislation, or is there sort of ways that you've been able to adapt with that new legislation coming in?
So through the chair, I mean, I think there are still a lot of moving parts right now with how that will land in Abbotsford. There's definitely some targets we need to hit as far as timelines, zoning, having zoning in place by a certain timeline and having our OCP updated by a certain timeline. So I think having said that, a fourplex could look, I think, different. It could be a duplex with suites. I think there's still some of the details that our fine community planning division is working through right now, and will give more direction moving forward as how that's going to relate to how it in Abbotsford that will land on the ground. But I think, speaking just from a bylaw perspective, what we've tried to, incorporate is more flexibility in how we deliver those replacements. So, with stock size reductions, allowing, 2 small trees instead of 1, medium-sized tree or 1 large tree. So I think it gives a little bit more flexibility as how you can move that planting around on a site where you might be looking at having, more coverage or more units. It's trees and development are always going to be sort of in a dance of where to find that balance. So I think what we can do with this one tool is really just to try and make it as flexible as it can be with how we replace trees, looking at more of a target, a canopy target as opposed to like you must plant 5 trees. Within the confines of what we can achieve in this specific regulatory bylaw, I think it's going to be that's what we can do for now, but it's an evolving process because there are so many other factors that are moving and we don't know exactly how all of those will land. So, yeah.
Maybe again, just to chime in and unpack that specific example that Melissa noted. And again, we're speculating, we're working with our planning and development colleagues, like we know specifically how this provincial acts are gonna come into place. But when Melissa noted, the 2 medium trees and 1 large tree, we actually work through that as a team, as an example around, okay, property gets redeveloped, there's 4 units, 6 units, whatever it may be, only have 1 planting opportunity, there's an opportunity for 1 large tree rather than 2 medium-sized trees, right? So we're conscious that, there's no more land being made, right? How do we make this bylaw as effective as possible, knowing it's lower levels, beneath kind of zoning and development, that type of thing.
And it's also recognizing that, on development sites where you maybe can only plant 2 small trees or 1 medium tree, there's, the cash and lieu component is obviously the second choice. Planting is the first choice, but there still is that component, so that basically just redirects planting to, areas of the city that the city has purview over. So.
John?
Just to follow up on Matthew's comments and yours. So I was thinking like recommendation 14 with an opt-out by the developers or the property owner of $750. That's nothing. If you're building a $2 million project, redeveloping a lot with a $2 million project, $750 is meaningless. And so if I were in that situation and I didn't see a way to effectively replace the trees that I'm taking out, a good example is I was thinking of a lot on I can't remember. I don't know, it's a street that I noticed where they literally mowed down all the mature Douglas firs on the lot and built a replacement home, right? And again, there was no consequences at all. Yeah, I would happily pay that just to get the nuisance out of the way. And so to me, there doesn't seem to be a lot of incentive. If you've got a redevelopment proposal that's significant, not just a renovation or a laneway home, but something significant, which is a lot of the, the lots that we're going to see in Abbotsford in densification. We're going to see that. Houses are going to get pushed over and we're going to get multiplexes and so on, right? That's inevitable. So I wonder if there's a mechanism that could be introduced into the bylaw to perhaps transfer those plantings to other lots nearby. Perhaps there would be people who would be willing to take on that tree if they want an extra tree on their lot. I know we do this with the Fraser Valley Conservancy in terms of compensation plantings. We plant thousands of trees. Watersheds Coalition as well. We plant thousands of trees every year. I've got 800 Western red cedars right now that are looking for a home, and I wonder if there's a way that we could introduce something like that, where if the developer or renovator could find a neighboring property that would be willing to take on a tree, to make it easier for them to, rather than just throw $750 at the city, we still get a tree. Is that something that could be considered? I know it's complex, but.
So maybe I'll just jump in on that one because I think it's good to put this in context around the overall urban forest strategy, right? This is one action item. There's 55 in that urban forest strategy. And I want to be mindful that we're not going to achieve all as it comes through this bylaw. But the fifth goal in the urban forest strategy is about partnering to broaden that urban forest stewardship. So I think there's a lot of actions in there that we're already discussing as staff around how do we incentivize, when we talked about incentivization here, but how do we incentivize just the standard homeowners? So, well, I'd like to plant a tree, or I'd like to, get some knowledge on maintaining a tree, or I'd like to partner with the city of my borough, or whatever it may be, right? So we're definitely on that page in terms of, how do we actually encourage maybe nearby property owners or other property owners to, forest there or maintain the forest on their property. But I'm very mindful that this, as Ms. Price mentioned, this is a regulatory bylaw, so trying to do too many things with it, I think, is going to slow it down to really a point where it's almost unwieldy. So I don't know if that provides a lot of hope, but I'm just mindful that trying to do too much with this.
But we have to consider the reality that densification is going to mean less trees. There's just doesn't seem to be any way around that. I don't see how we're going to on any given lot. And so if you multiply that by a whole street of people who are doing the same thing, because the incentives are certainly great, and the province certainly is incentivizing and promoting that approach for cities. How are we going to achieve any of this?
And I think we're quite mindful, if I may, we're
please.
quite mindful of that around the reality that, a single tree is not a single tree. And a lot of communities are focused on that, replacement ratio and just tree, right? We're focused, as Price mentioned, in terms of what's that canopy look like and what's that, that crown of maturity, right? For us working on this, that's the outcome, is ensuring that we get as many medium or better yet, large trees with fairly substantial, canopy at maturity to ensure that we have that 40% coverage, right? So
and you don't think like being able to having the developer or the homeowner being able to transfer that tree to a neighboring property would achieve that? I think it would.
Matthew.
Through the chair, just along with that idea, so the $500 probably goes into just a general account, right? Is there a possible way that it would be, say, earmarked for as an incentive for other homeowners that want to plant extra, and then they would get, say, a percentage, and you'd broker that off of your property taxes or whatever, but that would incentivize sort of local people to plant more.
Through the chair, so the money we collect for cash in lieu of planting the trees does go into a tree planting account. It's not a general fund, it's a restricted account. So I think, I think the funds in there, I think we can explore how we specifically spend those funds to enhance not only tree planting, but also perhaps programs that would incentivize. But I think that's a separate discussion outside of this bylaw. But it is sort of on our radar as something that we would have further discussions about, perhaps either through the implementation process or just separately with our finance division.
Thank you.
Okay, and then one more, and then I'll shut up. Recommendation number 9, you included in the costs of 1-year maintenance program or 1-year maintenance requirement. I mean, it's useful, but I know with the compensation projects that we do now with our Fraser Valley Conservancy and other groups, I think the minimum is 5 years. That's included in the applications and the grants that we get. We require a minimum of 5 years because 1 year just isn't enough. We see so many distressed trees around Abbotsford that aren't being maintained, and some of them owned by the city because there's not enough resources to keep track of all of the distressed trees that we see in our more and more often drought conditions. I think a 5-year policy or at least a 3-year policy would be more useful. 1 year just isn't enough. You get the tree in the ground and a year later, it hasn't really done much. You've got to keep it alive. And we have plantings all over the place that we need to maintain for 5 years, and then they're well rooted and they can survive droughts more easily.
So through the chair, I might, maybe I don't answer this succinctly enough, I might call on our consultant Camille, who's also in the wings there virtually. But I think the 1 year, it comes from a bit of a standard approach taken for a lot of different types of infrastructure. Usually it's a 1-year warranty period.
Yeah.
It's my understanding that yes, for things like trees, just given our changing climate and conditions, it often 1 year, it's okay, but it's not often enough. But I guess the challenge is balancing sort of the administrative, on one hand, the administrative costs to keeping something kind of on the books or whatever for a 5-year period, as well as, property owners might change hands over the course of 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And so when you're dealing with individual property owners, it can get a little bit more complicated, but that's certainly something that we can review, I think.
And I agree. I mean, these kinds of recommendations are really just symbolic anyway. There's almost no way to police or enforce these sorts of things. But it puts people on that level of awareness. Oh, I have to take care of this tree for 5 years. They may not do that, but like any bylaw, it's a guideline that helps people understand what their responsibilities should be. And like just that no, you can't police this, you can't enforce it, but it gives people a better understanding of what it takes to keep a tree alive.
I think something that John mentioned that's important to pick up on is that drought tolerance piece. So again, one of the administrative pieces that we have in there is improving that species list for replacement trees. So having trees that are more suitable for our environment now or our projected environment, 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now. I don't think we need to kind of remind anybody about climate change and temperatures and all those things we've experienced even locally in the past few years. But we're very mindful of that, is projecting that into the future and saying, what are those right species to place or to plant? not disagreeing with the perspective around like, hey, sometimes it takes more than a year to establish that. I think we'll be in better position if we're planting the right trees for the environment.
And were you not also including, sufficient dirt base for all new plantings as well?
Yeah, so maybe it would be good to have Camille just maybe supplement what I've already said, sort of on the warranty period and sort of some of the measures we can put in place.
Please.
Oh,
Can't hear
I
you.
think she's on mute.
So can't hear.
Are you, no?
There we go.
There we go.
Okay.
Okay.
Maybe there's just a little lag. All right, so good morning, everyone, and through the chair. Just to support the conversation there, I kind of see two pieces. So there was a reference made to recommendation 9, which is about the cost that someone removing a city tree would need to pay to the city. And then I think some of the conversation was also focused on the replacement tree securities that are being held by the city for a period of a year after planting to make sure that the tree survives after planting. So I guess to answer the first bit, so the 1 year maintenance cost that is included for the city tree cost that folks would need to pay, that is intended to mirror the same requirements that we would apply for the 1 year securities being held on private land. It could be higher potentially if the city felt as though it was legitimate to take more money to cover the cost of planting that tree on replanting that tree on public land. That being said, we're also allowing collection of the amenity value of that tree, meaning that we have another mechanism to recover some of those costs based on the assessed value of that tree. And as far as the maintenance period and survival of trees, I think there were a couple of good points that were made. Certainly one of the things that we want to introduce as part of this bylaw update are adequate spacing requirements, meaning that we ensure that the area where a tree is planted provides sufficient soil to support that tree. Drought impacts are felt worst if the tree has access to less soil, because that is where it accesses the water. So certainly, the species planted, the space where they're planted, and the access to soil are important pieces. As far as the holding of replacement securities through a maintenance period, we see sometimes 2 years instead of 1. Of course, that has implications for people who are providing that security, because it will be held half of it until the end of that period. So we're usually trying to seek a balance with the administration, the impact on the property owner, and ensuring survival. There might also be room to provide educational materials in addition to the extent of that maintenance period to support the idea of, your tree will still need watering even though we are refunding your deposit.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions around the table? Okay, seeing none, I thank you. We thank you.
Thank you very much.
And call the question on the recommendation. All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. That brings us to the end of our agenda. I don't know if there's any new business. I don't have any. Staff has any?
Mr. Chair, I wouldn't mind I know he was tied up with an operational matter, so we didn't get a chance to do it at the start, but we have a new colleague that maybe can introduce himself to the committee.
Sure. So I'm Riley Sloka. I'm the new director of Parks Operations. It's my second week, so learning a lot as I entered here, the city of Abbotsford. I come from Saskatchewan, Regina, so accustomed to a very different climate and very different trees. I'm always mesmerized by the height of trees here versus what I have in the prairies, which are probably shrubs for you. So really excited to be a part of this community and just learn more about what we have to offer.
Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right, then with no further ado, I will ask for a recommendation to adjourn. Anne, seconded by Steve. All in favor, I presume. We are adjourned. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you the next meeting.